Well, hello, everyone. I also have a housekeeping tip. If you have tea or coffee stains on the inside of your mugs and regular soap doesn't get it out, a little bit of baking soda, tiny bit of water, make a little paste, just rub it, it'll go away right away.
Oh, wow, thank you.
Yeah.
This is why he was an advice columnist.
Yeah. I also just want to acknowledge the discrepancy between the chairs and people in this room. It was very optimistic of them to set out so many on Thanksgiving weekend, the first real day of big snow in the year. And I assume that the live stream is audio only, so obviously it's standing room only, and it's a fire hazard. And I'd like everyone who's standing in the back to please sit down and stop applauding. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. It's so wonderful to see you all. Thank you all so much for coming out. It's very cold, and I assume that, like me, you were all still very full.
I would love to start us off with Danny doing a reading of the Women's Hotel first. Then I'm going to ask him a bunch of rude questions, and then you get to ask him a bunch of rude questions. Does that sound good? Okay.
Great, fantastic. I've also never done a reading in a library where there was still also a library going on. So I feel terrible talking on a microphone because we're in the library and people are here trying to read. But presumably the library knows its business. It happens here, so it's okay. I'm not gonna get in trouble. This is towards the end of the book, and this is about a relatively minor character who I had a lot of fun with, named Dolly. Dolly was hopelessly Irish looking, with a face as broad and as cheerful as a milk truck, small beaming eyes, a low squared-off hairline, and a squashed nose that smeared her profile. She wore stiff and heavily starched waistcoats over what must have been shockingly tenacious foundation garments, and either one of two suits, a brown one in winter and a light brown one in summer. People sometimes had to get a second look before they felt confident in knowing whether to address her as sir or miss, which did not often endear her to them. This meant that a lot of her interactions with strangers were kicked off with an inaugural sense of impatience on the side of the strangers, as if she were backward or withholding crucial information from them. And in Dolly's mannishness, men saw very little of themselves and a great deal of something else, something they neither understood nor wished for. As a general rule, they did their best to ignore her. But those who fell outside the general rule adored her, and she had what seemed to the rest of the Beidermeier girls an absolutely shocking number of men friends. There was scarcely a milkman or a doorman or a mailman on the entire East Side who did not seem to know her, or who would not specially hail her during his rounds for a smoke and a jaw session. For Dolly was as stately and as cheerful as a tugboat, and wore her squat ugliness with such unconcerned pleasure that it rested delightfully on her shoulders. That is not to say that people who loved her ever forgot that she was ugly. She remained ugly from the day of her birth right up until the last. She had been an ugly baby, and she made a wonderfully ugly old woman later on. Nor was she incessantly good-natured. She had an Irish temper, and was very often just as catty towards Lucianne as Lucianne was toward her. But she was terribly fun, and she was never angry for long, and once people stopped being strangers to her, they were usually her devoted friends. And like many unusual-looking people, she was tremendously thick-skinned. If people looked surprised or even angry at her appearance, she would plunge her hands into her pockets, thrust out her lower jaw, and aim a waterfall-sized smile at her audience until they smiled back despite themselves. And if they did not smile back, she simply sailed on her magnificent, boisterous little way. Dolly was a bartender, and she looked exactly like how a bartender ought to. She worked at an old bar in the village called Vernon's, which was less than 2 blocks away from the House of Detention, and saw its fair share of the recently sprung and hard up. Vernon's had a terrifically contentious relationship with this specific portion of its clientele, and nearly equally as contentious a relationship with Dolly. It had been operating in the neighborhood since the 1870s, when a significant portion of the populace was either Prussian or Hanoverian, and Avenue B was known as German Broadway. In those days, it had been a beer hall and a racing parlor and managed to undercut most of its competitors on the lunchtime sale of oysters, until by 1905 it was the only remaining bar on the block. It became a popular gathering spot for Hearst journalists and vaudeville actors in the first decades of the new centuries, when it also briefly featured a nightly burlesque show, but it was only now, in the 9th decade of operation, that Vernon's management suddenly began to take intermittent exception to the seediness which had always been its stock and trade. Depending on the time of day, which manager, and how many bartenders were on duty, Vernon's was either a fairly comfortable and no more than ordinarily discreet gay bar, or an ordinary, respectable, long-standing bar for the sexually normal that had to be regularly rescued from homosexual invasion by police. And depending on the same factors, either Dolly was a perfectly ordinary bartender whose cross-dressing was so erotically neutralizing, so unobtrusive, and a habit of such long standing that it was practically a local monument, no more dangerous than that statue of the Marquis de Lafayette in Union Square Park, or she was a pimp, a procurer, and a magnet for deviance. Dolly, for the most part, did not mind this, as she expected her employer to be her enemy, and considered it their job to try to strong-arm her back into women's clothing and her job to be too slippery to catch. Whether there really were more open homosexuals in the neighborhood now than 10 years previous, or whether the management had become more paranoid over the same period, was not a question Dolly could answer with satisfaction. Possibly it was a little bit of both. Certainly the homosexuals did not stop coming to drink there, or if they were briefly scared away, it was only in the same manner as pigeons in the park, who at most might flutter a few scattered feet away at the sound of impending human steps, then sail directly back to their former places, emboldened by their own numbers and habits. And just like with pigeons, the more seriously anyone tried to drive them off for good, the more foolish that person came to look. This particular night in early June was more tortured than usual, since Dolly was the only one tending bar, but she had been paired with Roscoe Almer, the most interfering and poison-minded shift manager on the schedule, who practically turned out people's pockets if they came in for a drink and he hadn't seen them before. Of course, he could be worse than that to someone he'd seen before and decided was a fairy. Sometimes he'd come by moments after she had served a customer and say, "Cut him off and get him out of here." Sometimes he'd do it himself, often waiting to interrupt until she was halfway through mixing the guy's drink, just to make things as uncomfortable as possible for everyone involved. This effectively dampened most of the regular spirits, so the greater portion bolted down their drinks and walked out the door within 20 minutes, hoping for better luck a little later on. But it nettled others, who grew waspish in return, asking loudly for the most sibilantly named cocktails on offer, drawing out each S until the whole room sounded carbonated. Dolly only made it worse. She'd get rid of anyone Roscoe told her to so fast the man never got the chance to pay his bill. "We don't want that kind of money, boss," she'd say if he objected to the shortness of her register. "When you say they're out, they're out. Who knows where that kind of money's come from? Anyone else need bumping? You just say the word. I don't care how much it costs us." Sometimes Dolly and the regulars would go into business together. They would pick up a pair of the most outrageous fairies they could find and order a round of the most expensive drinks on the menu, Brandy's Alexander or Planter's Punch, and after she'd mixed the drinks, but before they'd settled the bill, Dolly would realize her error and throw them out herself. If Roscoe seemed really agitated, she'd go to the back room to call the cops, which usually meant calling Nicola, unless Nicola was at work, in which case she'd call Katherine, who was almost always within shouting distance of the Beidermeyer's telephone, tying up the lines for at least 15 minutes before telling Roscoe, "Well, they had me waiting a while. I guess there's been a pretty nasty accident on Mott Street that's kept most of the officers busy a while. They needed a circular saw to open the car up and cut free a woman that was nearly crushed to death by her own roof, if you can believe it. But they're sending somebody around to take a look as soon as they can. No problems, no promises though. I told them I guessed we could take care of a couple of fairies without the fire department," and 100 other little tactics designed to wear Roscoe down to a nub. He was a very weathered-looking man when he at last retired in 1972.
I feel like one of a common descriptor for authors and or their books is clever. I feel like you actually live up to the word.
Thank you. That's very nice of you.
Clever.
It's not a question, but I appreciate it all the same.
It's not a question. But this one is. Look, I actually wrote the word clever even in my question. Your writing is clever, but also has such a clear voice. I am stunned by your ability to weave words like lest and forbade, your similes, right? She looked like a milk truck. Like, it all just fits the time and the place, and your voice is unbroken, and I would like to know how you do that.
Well, thank you very much. I love writing historical fiction. I think two of the books that I think of the most often in the writing of this book were Middlemarch and Mary McCarthy's The Group, both of which are themselves historical fiction, but I think we don't always think of them as historical fiction. They were both set roughly like 30 to 40 years in the recent past, and you know, The Group feels, I think, quite modern, even though it's set in the 30s, written in the 60s. Similarly, Middlemarch, we are at enough of a remove from it now that it's like, well, it's the 19th century, it's all old. Right. And so one of the things that I think was useful was I spent a lot of time in the years leading up to this reading a number of books from this era and getting a sense of, I'm sure absolutely that there are turns of phrase in this book that would not pass muster, that nobody said before the year 1980. And it sounds plausible to me because I am, a relatively young 38. And so I think, yeah, that sounds good. I wasn't there in the 60s. I didn't know. So I think that the thing that was most important to me in the writing of this book was that I wanted it to sound plausible rather than make sure every moment was note accurate. Like, accuracy interests me. I wanted to write lives that seemed like they could have happened. But yeah, the air of plausibility, a sense of being in that time and place felt important to me. So trying to think of, some characters who would have had a more classical education and who would have spoken more properly, others who would have done less so, but who would still, I think what they all held in common was there were things that I would happily, easily, and casually say, somebody in 2024, that they would never dream of saying, not even to their closest friends. And so trying to think of different types of inhibition, I think, is often really interesting. I like writing about inhibition, and I think that was one of the reasons that this book interested me, both in the sense of its historical setting and also in the sense of these are, broadly speaking, these are polite people. Like, I think Dolly and Pauline are probably the most out there. They're not people who are going to be hippies in a couple of years. And so thinking a lot about the sort of unspoken codes of conduct that none of them would be thinking consciously about, but that would define how they operate on a daily basis was really interesting and worthwhile to think about.
Love it. I could not tell which establishments were real and which you completely made up in the book. And it was so delightful. I was like, how are his descriptions equally good for the places? Okay. Where do I even start? Okay, so my first question is, how much research went into this?
This is a question I've occasionally been asked. I have a good pat answer. More than Wikipedia, less than a degree. So, I spent maybe 6 months going to the New York Public Library a couple of weekends out of each month and looking through old Gail Green articles in the Post about women who lived at the Barbizon, which was a real women's hotel. And the Beidermeier is the only fictional women's hotel in the book. All the others I mention, even the Jeanne d'Arc home for friendless French women, is real. They called it friendless. And at the time, the 1890s, this was not an insult. It was the sort of sense of, if you are a woman going to a city living alone, you will be doing so under the protection of friends. They will be setting you up. They will be speaking for you socially. They will, stake your reputation. If you don't have that, this institution will do it for you. But no, it sounds very harsh. Just the Jeanne d'Arc home for fucking losers. I won't curse again in the library. So again, the nice thing was in a novel, you get to decide how much of the detail that you want to incorporate. So I wanted there to be references. I wanted it to feel like the city was a busy place, full of places to go. But I didn't want to get too bogged down in details. And one of the other nice things about writing about a relatively unimportant group of people is I didn't have to worry about, like, oh man, is the moon landing about to happen? Or, like, did I just forget that, like, JFK was assassinated that day and no one talks about it? Like, there's very little in the book of national importance, so I did not have to. Like, the 60s are a well-known decade. People write a lot about it. New York City, many people have heard of, some have even visited. So, like, if you're not careful, you can really get tripped up in just the sort of, like, signposting that often happens. Like, the 60s are an exciting and vital time that just feels totally deadening, totally neutralized, totally, like, that's not how people think and talk about their own lives. And so it helped to focus on minor things like the history of Old First Presbyterian Church down in the village, or I think
one of my favorite passages is Katherine all in her head as she thinks about what it means to be Presbyterian.
That was my Barbara Pym
delicious.
pastiche chapter. That was just fully like, I'm going to sneak that chapter in there and hope nobody yells at me. But all the restaurants are real. None of the food is made up.
I definitely
There's a lot of food in the
about
book.
the food.
I liked thinking about that very, very much. Yeah.
It was just so fun, Danny. It was just so fun.
And the other thing, sorry, just the last
please,
thing
keep
about
going.
research that was really fun was the book opens with this sort of like panicked preparation for moving day, which again was real from roughly the colonial Dutch era up until just after World War II. All leases in New York City expired at the same hour on the same day, 9 a.m., May 1st. So everybody, you can actually, if you go to like Wikimedia Commons and look up Moving Day, you will see like 19th century paintings of just like carts and horses and pianos in the streets. It's like a Benny Hill themed, like everyone's just running down out of their buildings. I mean, it just sounds like the worst municipal, like Robert Moses would kill himself if he heard about it. He's a bad person, he should, but he's also no longer with us. I will not suggest anyone else kill themselves in the library. Now, it's 2 strikes, Daniel. But it was just this absolutely deranged way to organize your life. And for some reason, everyone in New York City was like, I guess we got to do this for 200 years and then some. And so it faded sensibly by the end of the 40s, but I liked the idea of, early 60s, the Beidermeier has still hung on to this old tradition because that's what happens at the Beidermeier is.
Okay, one of my questions is definitely which room would you have chosen on moving day?
They're
What
all,
would have
they're all the
prioritized?
same. I mean, that's part of what was fun is like I would also go and look in the like microfiche. Microfiche? Does anyone?
Fiche?
I'm in a library, of course.
I know,
everyone's
right?
gonna say it. Thank you. Thank you all. And you can see a lot of the old advertisements would have pictures of the rooms. And again, it's part of the appeal of the residential hotel, even the really fancy ones that you sort of had to be, like in an exciting cultural profession to get into. The idea was like, this is pretty democratic. There's not a lot of penthouses. There's not a lot of suites. I think the Beidermeier, the 11th floor, a couple of the rooms have been sort of cobbled together into suites and have like an ensuite bathroom, but that's about it. So by and large, they are all the same, like 400 square foot, cell.
Listen,
And I would love any one of them.
Yes, you would.
I would love it.
Yes,
Are you
you
kidding me?
would.
I have spent a number of personal vacations at monasteries, so I would do that, no question. There's a really great one in Big Sur, California, and you have to work really hard. They have the domain contemplation.com, because of course they got online in like 1993, and you could get really good website domain names then. But half the year they're flooded out, because Big Sur, every time it whispers rain, the whole Highway 1 goes out. But you should all try to get a room there sometime. It's the most beautiful place in the world. You'll be in a beautiful little cell overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and like you can see the moon plunge into like a sea of boiling fog at night. It's enchanting. It's wonderful, and it's like $60 a night or something fantastic, and it's so quiet and beautiful. And you get to hang out with like Episcopalian monks, which are nothing. Like, what's a Episcopalian? You don't have to get mad at them for their religion because they're Episcopalian. Or you can, of course.
Well,
I realize the whole point of like Episcopalianism is like, you can't get mad at us. We're not the Catholic Church, and that's how they get away with so much. But we're getting off topic. You should ask me your next question.
Get all your housekeeping and travel tips from Danny Lavery. The reason I ask about moving day is because even though you are 1,000% right that it ultimately would not matter one way or the other, I was a resident director at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, and let me tell you, these students will fight over a room that is all the exact same, right? And this is what I loved, is because it really does come down to these tiny details, like which direction does the window face? What, right?
Yeah, how many people am I sharing a bathroom
That's
with?
right.
That's the other problem is like, this is back in the day where having your own room means you share the bathroom down at the end of
That's
the hall.
right.
Which to me is a nightmare.
Yeah.
Not because I don't like sharing with other people, I don't mind doing that, but it means you have to walk back slightly damp. Because no matter how much you towel off, you're not really dry until it's been about 20 minutes.
That was definitely my college
and just
experience. It was
walking
community
anywhere
bathrooms.
Damp. And of course I would wear shower slippers. I'm not an animal. But like, just the feeling of being damp in a hallway is very unpleasant.
I love it so much. Okay, so now that we know that the Beidermeier is the one that is not real, I would love to know what in the illustration you were like, this must have. Did you care about the illustration?
Okay,
like,
very much.
Tell me about this.
As you may or may not know, authors don't really get to choose their covers. It's a little bit like if you write for a newspaper, you don't get to choose your headline. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. And so if you write a book, unless you are Stephen King, they will eventually say, here is your book cover. Would you like to tell us that you like it? And if you really hate something,
Right.
and you want to push for it, they will certainly take your opinion into account.
That's right.
But they do not have to. And this is my favorite cover that I've ever gotten to have.
Really?
Certainly, I think, again, just because I wanted it to just be really concrete. I love books. Like, I think of The Westing Game as a cover that I really remember from my own childhood. Like, it was such a vivid, arresting. And I love any cover that's like a large building or a hotel where the front has been peeled away. That feeling of both like Sesame Street-like, urbanity, and then also like voyeurism.
Yes.
Those are the two things. I love feeling like a voyeur on Sesame Street. And I wanted that to be the sort of vibe. And so, yeah, the cover, I love that a lot of the windows are empty. You can see,
so
like,
cute.
this is a half-occupied building.
Yeah.
It's getting a little crummier around the edges.
Yep.
But it also looks, like, exciting and interesting, and, like, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's filled with stories.
Yeah, and I loved it. It was the first time that I was just presented with a cover, and I was like, great.
I know you well enough to know that you are a literature nerd. And so I would love to know what your references or inspiration were for writing The Women's Hotel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had mentioned earlier, I think Mary McCarthy's The Group, which, if you're familiar with Mary McCarthy, it's probably because of The Group. It came out in 1963. It was set between the years of 1933, I think, up to 1939, 1940, about a group of women who had all graduated from Vassar together and then lived in New York. And it's very fun. It's very dishy. In some ways, it was kind of complicated for her reputation because she'd been sort of more literary. And then when the book came out, a lot of her peers and her critics sort of thought that this was too dishy, and so that's a sort of interesting touchstone. Rona Jaffe's The Best of Everything a few years earlier, 1958. That was specifically about a group of young women working in publishing, but again, it's like young women living in New York City. And then there's also a little bit further afield, but in the 20s there was Nella Larsen's Passing. And all of them have a sort of interesting element in common, which is towards the end of the book, a woman falls out of a skyscraper to very different effects. And in very different tones, but that was a sort of interesting, recurring. And of course, you end with the splat episode of Sex and the City from 2004, because in passing, it's incredibly poignant and tragic, and there's no facetiousness to it. There's nothing funny about it. And then in each sort of iteration of this version of complicated women's friendships in New York, it gets a little bit crueler and a little bit funnier until you get Kristen Johnston smoking a cigarette in Sex and the City, saying the city is over, and then falling out the window, and Carrie Bradshaw saying it was the first time she'd ever left a party early, which is so brutal. I love it. It's wonderful. Sex and the City does not really feature in this book, although, of course, it's in the background of all that we do. And then I think the other references that came up for me the most often was there's a great imprint in the UK called Furrowed Middlebrow, and it's an offshoot of Dean Street Press. And it's fantastic. And it's run by a guy named Scott Thompson, who I think is a genius and should win a MacArthur Grant. And all that they do is reprint out-of-print books written by British and North American women authors who published between 1910 and 1960. And I really got into this, especially during the pandemic. And I think one of the things that I loved, the tone and the scope of the books can vary wildly, but often it's just... It takes domestic, mundane concerns very seriously. And the tone can often be light or lively, but it's incredibly sincere and earnest about small things. And so I think of those, O. Douglas, who, if you know her at all, it's as the sister of John Buchan, who wrote The 39 Steps, which is a great thriller that's very confusing, and Hitchcock made a movie out of it. She wrote books that were nothing like that. But they were fabulous, and she wrote one called The Day of Small Things, which is just about a few weeks in the lives of some incredibly conservative Scottish aristocrats whose values I almost universally do not hold. But I found it absolutely, gripping and compelling. And I think Rachel Ferguson's Evanfield, which is a lightly comic Proustian recollection of an Edwardian house, again, could not put it down. Lost my mind reading it. You must read it. Ruby Ferguson's Apricot Sky. I think all of those kind of come into play. I will stop listing books.
literary nerd.
But you should
in
get all of
time.
them today.
Okay, there are so many delicious characters in this book. I'm going to ask the question that no author wants to answer, which is, are any of these people you? Or
No,
like you?
No, but 3 of them are based on real people.
Ooh.
Yeah. Lucianne is very, very loosely based on Jonah Goldberg's mother, Lucianne Goldberg, who in college created an anti-women's lib group called the Pussycat League that published, I think, 3 essentially zines and did nothing. That was it. It really fizzled out. But one of the things that I love about Lucianne is she really sort of delights in needling the other residents of the hotel and sort of like dismissing this idea of like women living together. But she also needs the hotel in order to play that kind of role. Like if she just lived in a regular apartment building, it wouldn't be funny or novel or slightly edgy. So she's someone who requires something that she would like to hold in contempt. And that's really fun. Stephen, the elevator operator, is loosely based on Stephen Donaldson, who was a prison activist who lived in New York City and who was also the first openly gay student to attend Columbia. He was accepted in the early 60s. He called the dean of students and he said, "I would like to attend Columbia. You've just accepted me. You should know I'm openly homosexual. Can I still go?" And they said, "We'll call you back." And after a couple of weeks, they got back in touch and they said, we talked it over at a meeting. And we've decided that you can attend if you promise to attend psychoanalysis 3 times a week and not to seduce any of your fellow students. Which is kind of an amazing setup. And like in some ways, like, all right, free therapy from school? Okay. I mean, conversion therapy, but still therapy. Free is free. Free is free. So that's Stephen, and then Gia Kassab is loosely based on Joan Brady, who's an English writer who I love. She was married to Dexter Masters, who was another great author who wrote a terrific book in the 50s called The Accident that's loosely based on the Demon Core meltdown. I think it's out of print, but you can usually find paperback copies online for not too much. The hardcover is a couple $100, don't bother, but the paperback is usually still easy to find. And she wrote an incredible essay for The Telegraph in 2012 called Why I Stole My Mother's Lover. Sometimes it's paywalled. It's worth it. It's short. It's exquisite. I read it in 2012, and it's just been sort of at the back of my mind ever since. And it's just this beautiful, looking back over the past, and it's just like, I knew someday I would marry Dexter Masters. I hadn't seen him for years. I was a beautiful young dancer. I moved to New York City. I found him. His wife had just died. And I was a beautiful dancer, and I could just make... It's like she writes about her body and her will the way that I think like Tom Cruise and Scientology people think. Like, he'll like give interviews, and he's like, it's so tough being a Scientologist because you'll go by a car accident and you just want to stop because you know you can fix it. Like just that level of like, what I want to happen in the world happens. And so she's just like, and I made him marry me, and we lived very happily together, and I knew my mother would never really get over it, and she didn't, and she died of a heart condition that I later inherited. And it's just brutal, it's relentless, it's savage, it's gorgeous. Like, it's such, like, deep owning of this, like, libidinal cruelty in herself that I love and I think about often. So I just lifted that plot point wholesale, and then I took it in ways that I wanted to go and thought about like what would a person in such a position get out of that. But she that is not like me. I've never done anything nearly that cool.
You have already touched on this, but I'm just going to read the question anyway. The mental life of your characters is delicious. I just love the way you poke around their heads, and especially Katherine, as she's in church, thinking about her scorecard, thinking about Alcoholics Anonymous, thinking about why being Presbyterian is like the exact right place for her to be. And this is not a question, except that I'm really interested in how you wander through the minds of your characters.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. I think, it can be a difficult balance because I think you do want enough plot points and action in the book that it is not simply a group of people sitting around thinking about their neighbors. Although I can imagine a book that was truly just one chapter per person thinking about their neighbors, I would probably read that. But I really value stories where personality and passing time together, hanging out together, is an important component of the story. It's something that I really like about Miyazaki films. It's something that I really like about the work of O. Douglas. It's not the same thing as no conflict or no story, but the depth of personalities and the way that they think about the people that they live near is really interesting and important to me. And so, especially with Katherine, who's one of the sort of main perspective characters, and who spends a lot of time thinking. Like she's a character who does less than many of the others. And the sort of only other building that we spend a lot of time in outside of the Beidermeier is Old First, which is a real church with a real history. Everything that I mentioned in that chapter did happen. I don't think I invented any institutions outside of the Beidermeier. I could be and I suppose Mrs. Mosler's first tea house. That's not real either. Sorry. But I think especially like Katherine's a person who is, her relationship to institutions is one that interests me. Like the 1960s is really the first decade where people, obviously there'd been a drop off in, church attendance for quite some time, but like the 60s is really where mainline Protestant church attendance starts to just go off a cliff. And so I was a little bit interested in thinking about, again, being slightly out of step. That's when she starts attending. And she both attends and holds it at arm's length. And she's also a person who goes to AA, and around that time, a woman in AA would be not unheard of, but definitely a little bit unusual. And I think also it would have been, recent enough, like AA was founded in the early 30s, that in some ways I think it would have had this feeling of like, this is an exciting and fresh new post-war technology. This is like cutting edge ways of helping you deal with your own personality and living in community with other people. This is the future. And so sort of her experience with two different cultural, spiritual institutions, one of which is waning in its importance, and one of which is gaining in importance, and kind of going through both of those things and thinking about the world around her was something that I really wanted to get to do. And it's nice you can kind of distribute plot to some of the slightly more satellite characters so that you get the sense of momentum, and then a character you can slow down a little bit with. And I think Katherine is someone who gives you a chance to do that.
Okay, this is my last planned question, so y'all get yours ready, okay? I lost the question. This happened to me the last time I was on this stage.
We can vamp.
Hold on, it's gonna come back.
I can talk more about Sex in the City.
It's gonna come back as
Your
soon as
jacket
one of
looks
you
great.
ask your questions.
Yeah,
That's what's
well,
gonna happen.
Why don't we open things up to
Yes,
questions from the
it
audience?
will come back to me.
And when it comes back, you should have written it down. I see you're holding cards in your hand. You should have written that one down.
I did not write this one down.
You didn't think ahead.
I didn't. I'm not prepared at all. Do any of you have
You're doing
questions
so great,
you'd like
and I
to
love you so
ask?
much. And I'm so glad
I know
you're
what it
here.
was.
Oh,
I got it.
fantastic. Everyone
I got it.
shut up.
I would love to know if there's a community of women or a community in general that you are like relying on, encouraged by, a part of, meaningful to you.
Oh my gosh, everywhere. But I live with two women. They're terrific. We have a baby. He's not a woman. He's a baby. He's small. But they're terrific, and I dedicated the book to them. It's a small community, obviously, but we spend a lot of time together. And there's a wonderful community of women in the Bay Area that I've known for about 10 years now, and we have a daily group chat, and I'm going to get to see them all later this month, which I'm very excited about. So I'm really looking forward to that. But yeah, I mean, I think women writers, groups of women really interest me and always have. And so in that sort of Barbara Pym, Rona Jaffe, Mary McCarthy tradition of thinking seriously about the psychology of like women in certain urban settings, it's just something that I often really, really love to get to read. And I think my favorite review of the book, somebody had mentioned that this seems like a book that the author would have wanted to read. And that felt really meaningful to me, because that is often the type of writing that I'm the most drawn to, is when there's a sense of obvious pleasure.
I really love the amount of respect and love and intrigue with which you write women. It feels honoring of our complexity.
Thanks. Well, thanks. Back at you. Yeah, if anyone in the audience has any questions, we'd be delighted to hear from you. You also don't have to. We just talked a lot, and maybe you'd like to go home and eat some more leftovers. So if you have a question, terrific. If not, thank you so much for coming out. This is delightful.
We thought, this is what I wanted to do.
Yeah, so the question was just, when did I start writing? And was there a sort of conscious moment when I really decided it was something that I wanted to do? Yeah, I think, like many writers, I wrote early and often, not always with great discipline, but always with great pleasure. I think the discipline came later, and it was harder to add to the mix, and I often wanted simply for the pleasure to carry the day. And I think also relatively early, I had a sense of I really want to do this for a living, and I'm not quite sure how, but I'll need to figure that out because I won't find anything else bearable or acceptable in that sort of like over-the-top way that can make you really difficult as a fourth grader who's already thinking about like, my life will not be acceptable unless I can live it on the right terms, and I must be able to write, which again can really carry you through, but can also make you a little bit trying at recess. And so I think, I would have a stronger and stronger sense of I must do this, but that would not necessarily be accompanied by a stronger and stronger sense of how to make it happen. And so I think especially after I had graduated college and was really at odds, like I didn't have anything to do, and I spent a few years kind of cobbling together jobs, waiting tables or interning, and sort of thinking like, I need to find a way to make writing happen, and I just need to find it. And that was a sort of odd time around like 2011, 2012, when there were just a lot of websites and a lot of blogs, and you could just email people who would write for free all day and who you thought were funny or interesting and ask if you could write for them. And so I wrote to Edith Zimmerman, who is a genius and profoundly influential on all my writing and my entire career. She ran a website called The Hairpin at the time, and I asked if I could write for her, and that was the first time. It's probably not true. I'm sure I had written occasionally for websites before that, but that was the one that really got me started. And it was very much a sense of, I came across her writing, and it just, I felt like a sense of, a combination of recognition and being spurred on to something, both like, this is familiar, I knew this would be there if I looked for it, I'm so glad it's real. And then also, I've got to up my game if I want to be worthy of this kind of thing, which is something that is really lovely about being alive, is sometimes you discover things like that. And so, obviously there's a lot that happened from there, and I had to build it slowly, but that really felt like, okay, if someone's doing this, I can make my way ahead. But yeah, it's been pretty consistent. It was not like, I really wanted to be an astronaut, and then later I took a hard left turn. I mean, we all wanted to be astronauts in the sense that they ask you when you're in kindergarten to draw what job you want to have someday, and you're like, I've heard of 2 jobs. I can draw you an astronaut or a ballerina. Yeah.
It's really fun to think about Danny as a 4th grader, isn't it?
There's a tiny baby. Sorry, I just saw the tiniest baby. I know this baby. Hi, baby. Oh, you're so small. Wow, my baby's so big now. But recently, he was very small like that. Oh my God, how do they get so big so fast? Oh, what has he done? Oh, man.
Danny's gonna need a minute.
My baby was that size yesterday, I swear it.
I actually saw your baby when he was 2 weeks old, and he was.
I did too. Yeah.
Basically.
I wanted to just say to you first, and it was bonkers.
What in the world? So for anyone who couldn't hear, Montreal has its own moving day, July 1st, and they still do it?
Well, I don't know if they do now, but as of about 2006.
But recently, within the last 2 decades, they were doing it. That's much more recent than World War II.
Yeah, before moving, like that's the day you went out to try to get all your new furniture.
So it was just everybody who had a truck just making millions of dollars that day?
There's a lot of men with vans off Craigslist.
Of course there were. Of course. And you could charge whatever you want. It's just like, as far as I can see, and again, I'm not good at moving. I don't visualize things well in space. I'm not handy in any way. I'm not like an urban planner. But like, I think I could devise any system better than that for moving. That's the worst system I can possibly. Everyone move on the same day in Montreal all at once. I'm glad you're here.
so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you. Can I just hand you this? I don't want anybody to miss this. Danny cannot recap this.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
So I'm winding the story back. When I was 10 years old, I was growing up in Wilmington, Delaware, and my mother took me to New York for a New York weekend, and we stayed at the Barbizon. And there was a cafe. What I remember being totally charmed by it, the adventure, and a hotel full of women. How wonderful is that? And there was this little hotel. There was this little bar at the cafe on the first floor, and we had half cantaloupes with lemon. And I'd never had lemon on cantaloupe before, and it was the most wonderful thing. And I still put lemon on my cantaloupe.
Thank you.
The Barbizon was wonderful, and my mother was very much a white glove white lady. So that was what we did.
I would not have known that you could stay there just over the weekend. Like it wasn't just a residential hotel. but you could also just
we
pop
were
in.
there for a weekend. Yeah. So that's the story.
Thank you.
And my question is about characters not from this book, but from websites. The two monks. I love them so much. I love them so deeply, and the thing that is so mysterious, and here's the question. How, and I can't even make the question, but there is so much love in the way the two monks talk to each other, and there is so much love in the way you imagine them, and I can feel that in your other writing too. I love the guy who joins the Babylonian army. He has that same, quality about him. But so there is a way in which you love your characters, and I think this is a spiritual question I'm asking you. It's like, how do I love the world the way you love your characters?
Well, again, a beautiful question. I thank you for it. Yeah. And just for anyone who's not familiar, the two monks are unrelated to Women's Hotel. It's a series of characters that I've done in a sort of jokes about largely medieval art history that I've done for a while on various websites. I do them sometimes on the chat. I'll do one next week for you. You got it. You got it. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's done. It's done. It's done. Yeah. It's done. I think especially, I don't know if you're familiar with the cloud of unknowing. Of course you are. Of course. But I think, because it is so easy for jokes about medieval art especially to just become, well, they don't know what this animal looks like. That's funny. They're incompetent. That I think is, which I think is like, it's like the shadow version of what two monks aren't. And I think this is more like The Cloud of Unknowing is an anonymous book of Christian mysticism that has to do with the forgetting that you must put under your feet in order to approach God. And I think that in the Two Monks series especially, there is a sense of not bumbling, but delighting in and sharing more than ignorance, absolute bewilderment, absolute lostness. And they are rooted to each other and to their work in that lostness. And they are not worried about finding their way. They're worried about encouraging each other, and they're worried about creating. And so that is why I think that it is so fun to return to. Because again, I think if it was just that elephant doesn't look very good, the joke would have worn pretty thin pretty fast. And so I think, the question of how do I love the world like somebody else loves characters, obviously it's so much easier to love characters than to love people because I get to go sit in a quiet room and invent people. And I get, it's a little bit like that old Peanuts comic where Linus talks about how he wants to grow up to become a humble little country doctor. And he wants to be the most famous humble little country doctor who drives a little roadster into the country every day. And it just gets more and more elaborate. And I often feel that way. I often want to sit in a room by myself and think about, gosh, I'm so good at loving people. Gosh, I'm so humble. And just get really carried away with this vision of myself that only exists when I am alone in a room imagining things. The work of, I don't live in the 1960s in this exciting hotel with these problems. I live in a house in Michigan with people, with real people and a baby. And I often have to do things that I don't want to do. And worse, I have to do things that don't seem reasonable to me because everything that I want to do feels reasonable in my own head. I can always justify it. It always makes sense to me. I always give myself the benefit of the doubt, the most backstory. Well, I want to do this because of X, Y, and Z, excellent reason. And I have so many good reasons for needing the things that I need. And the work is always, I must extend that to other people, even and especially when I don't want to. All of which is just to say, I share that work with you. I also find it difficult. I think we have to begin in our shared lostness and encourage each other. And I'm very glad you came here tonight. I'm very glad you told that story. I'm so jealous of you, I can't even tell you. The closest I got is, I had my very first popover when my mother took me to Neiman Marcus for lunch in high school. And I don't know if you knew this, but Neiman Marcus is a really upscale department store. Well, some of them have restaurants. And some of them have restaurants that are like so nice. And they give you, at the beginning of each lunch, a huge popover, size of your head, fresh out of the oven, with a pat of strawberry butter and some frankly indifferent chicken broth. But the popover is so good, and you're sitting in this like it feels like you're in the dancing scene from Beauty and the Beast. And that was also the first time in my life I saw tea models, and I think that was part of why I love that sort of like lost or obsolete meals from the sort of architecture around types of lifestyles that are mostly vanished. Like tea models, if you watch like 1939 The Women, which you should, it's excellent. George Cukor directed it. It's a fantastic cast. Norma Shearer at her absolute best. She spends the whole movie almost crying but not quite letting a tear fall. It's incredible. But like, you would look at clothes, usually not on a mannequin, but just like a woman would walk into a room and like turn around. And so tea models used to come into like lunchrooms and show off, outfits you could buy. They do that at Neiman Marcus still at the luncheon. Like I'd never known this. We were not a Neiman Marcus family. This was like a very special occasion. And all I knew was we're eating lunch in this beautiful rotunda, and this woman is walking around from table to table, stopping and talking to everyone, and then just sort of like shrugging and showing off her fur coat. And I was just like, Mom, this unbelievably self-centered woman, you gotta get a load of her. She's just going to everyone's lunch and interrupting to show off her jacket. And my mom's like, you idiot, that's a tea model. She didn't call me an idiot. But I was so just like, I couldn't believe that was how people lived or like were provided information. I just was like, I gotta find a way. I gotta get on the social register or something, because I need to be the kind, like, as much as I'd wanted to be a writer, I then also wanted to be like insanely wealthy and like, yeah, high society. Just like, I need to be eating a popover and somebody comes, but like, I feel like a barbarian king. Like, show me what outfits I might wear later. And someone just has to walk in front of me like, you could wear this. And I'd be like, I will, buy it, bring it to me. Like, it felt savage. It felt like something that, like, Genghis Khan would have done in a movie. Not even in real life, like a movie about Genghis Khan. But it was happening to, like, very polite women at the San Francisco Neiman Marcus. And it was just, yeah, that sort of polite barbarianism that I just adore.
That's hysterical.
It was a true memory. Yeah, so the question was just if I would ever collect or collate any of the various things that I've written online into a book. I think certainly, obviously my first book, Text from Jane Eyre, was just that. Although that was also like a time and place when if you had a gimmick website and you wanted a book, you could just walk into New York and say like, I have a website, I want a book of jokes, and somebody would say, you got it. So I think certainly that would be of interest, especially now that there feels like such a shift in, I think 10 years ago there was still more of a sense of sort of the internet is forever, and now we're in slightly more of like the internet is very ephemeral and everything is going away. I know that the All, for example, is reprinting a lot of old pieces. I've got one in there. And so I think that'd be something that'd be really fun to do. I would love to do that. I will mention that to my agent later. So you got it. Yeah, I mean, it's like, would I like to put out another book of stuff I've already written? Yeah, I think that's a little part of why I feel not super enthusiastic, not because I wouldn't love the free money, but it does always feel a little difficult to be like, obviously no one would be forced to buy it, so they could just do it if they wanted to. That would be nice. But I'd feel a little, I'd want to do a little something more, just so it felt like you were doing more than just picking up a bunch of PDFs I'd printed out. I think we have time for one more, and then we should let all you nice people go home.
So you talked about how it's easy to love, like, you know, the into your writing or made it into just sort of your psyche.
Yeah, so this question had more to do with my work as an advice columnist, which I did for about 5 years, and I think sort of whether any of those questions either stuck with me personally, but then also whether some of that made its way into Women's Hotel. None of the questions that I was asked ever come into the book, not even like slightly disguised. But I do think it's very much the kind of book you write after you stop being an advice columnist. Because it's very much like, here are snippets of a lot of different people's lives kind of presented all at once. And that was one of my favorite things about being an advice columnist, was just my sheer nosiness. It was just like, strangers would email me all day and tell me the juicy details about their personal problems and ask me to opine upon them. I think that was part of why at 5 years I needed to stop, because it was just like, I mean, at the time I was like 35, and it was just like, I think I've used up all my life experience, and at this point, like, I have no more, like, I could say the same things over and over again, but I think I need to be done. And so I both think that sort of sense of like deep curiosity about small details of people's lives was still at play, but then also the pleasure of, I don't have to worry about advising people to do what I think will be the best thing. I can just think imaginatively about what might a person do in this situation, and not, gosh, I really need to like help this woman repair her relationship with her sister, which is like worth doing, but really nice to take that load off your shoulders. But yeah, a similar sense of sort of peeling back the front layer and like looking into an apartment building. And I think the thing that often came up would be questions about apartment living in Dear Prudence, and it would often be questions about noise, and what do I do about noise? And part of me knows that if you live in a big building with a lot of other people, you cannot control how noisy they are. But is there something I can do to control how noisy someone else is? And noise doesn't really come up in this book, but I think that sort of general question of, I live near a lot of people, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes it drives me mad. And how do I bear the fact that I cannot control anyone around me? I think was something